So, like I said, we're a full-scale leadership development firm that does leadership diagnostics, surveys, training, a lot of lately customized leadership accelerators. So an organization will come in and say, we've never done leadership development or professional development for our staff. What do we do? And so that we work with them by doing surveys, listening sessions to try to understand what type of leadership training do people need, and what do they need at different levels, and what topics do they need, and what are the optimal groups, and do we blend it with online learning, and what are the resources, and is there a community platform, and basically completely customizing it to their needs. And then I also teach the Women's Leadership Challenge. Oh, I also have, excuse me, I have a podcast called Samantha Politics, which is about global politics. I've covered about 60 countries, conflicts, crises, women's movements, elections. My buddy Admiral Stavridis on there, but mostly I interview women's rights activists and really try to lift the voices of women in foreign policy and decision making. And I also am working on a book called Your Intrinsic Power Map, Leveraging Your Authentic Self to Change the World, for which I received the Bellagio Fellowship. This is enough about me. I gave a TEDx. Already talked about this. The other thing that we're doing lately, which is kind of interesting, is organizational change strategy. So an organization recently came to us and said, we want to be leaders on climate change. How do we position ourselves? How do we activate our members? What do we do? How do we become leaders in this area? And how do we create momentum on this social issue? So that's a new type of consulting that we're doing lately as well. Okay, it's just some of our clients. The Wilson Center, Graham Packaging, Distilled Spirits Council, Iron Source, Harvard, Department of State, Monday, etc. Our values, and this is, I think, we're going to be talking about feminist leadership today, but these are really feminist leadership values as well. And then I realized that they were our values, which is courage, and courage not in the form of, riding on a white horse and breaking down the gate to the, all the militaristic stuff, more emotional courage, to make hard decisions, to have hard conversations, to dispute conflict, to push a boulder of a proverbial hill, to speak truth to power, community. And I'm really excited to bring all of you women together, because community is so critical to supporting women who are often fighting against the status quo. And we need to support each other and to lift each other up. Collaboration, which is also a feminist leadership principle, right? How do we appreciate things not as a zero-sum game or you win, I lose, but more, how do we collaborate to achieve our common goals of gender justice, gender equity, and human rights for all. Co-design, about creating programs that really have an impact and that have deep buy-in and design and survey or feedback from the people who we're implementing them for. Compassion, always thinking empathetically, but that also does not mean getting stepped on. And connection, creating connection at deep and meaningful levels. One thing I like to say is that, to create a truly transformational experience for leaders, you have to touch the heart, the body, the spirit, and the mind. So a lot of retreats lately that we've been designing have really been experimenting with alternative methodologies to be able to touch the heart, the body, the spirit, and the mind. And then I teach the Women's Leadership Challenge, which I will tell you more about, but essentially the Women's Leadership Challenge was created because I saw that most leadership literature and programming was based on literature by white Western corporate men, and Sheryl Sandberg, and wasn't really about changing the system. It was about conforming to the status quo and kind of getting ahead in a man's game, but it wasn't authentic to who women are. And so after working with a lot of women's rights activists, I realized that women were leading and changing systems differently, brought them together in Italy, found out even more of that, and no one was teaching it. So the Women's Leadership Challenge is, a program for women leaders to step into their power, to understand who they are, to learn how to advance within the society that exists, how to embody feminist leadership principles, and how to create culture change. And we'll put a link to that in the chat, but that is the Women's Leadership Challenge. We are recruiting for our next cohorts. So if you're interested or know anyone else who's interested, we'll put the link in the chat. That's not what today is about. So I'd love to know from you, if you could put in the chat, and I know Christine's in the car, if you're not able to get to the chat, but what would be most helpful for you to learn today as we think about the oncoming elections? Because I have a slide deck that might take 10 years. So what would be most helpful for you to learn today? Or for me to approach, because as usual, I over-prepared. You can put it in the chat, or if you're in the car, you feel free to just come off of mute. Anyone have thoughts on this? Information overload. Okay. Kamala, new cyber issues you had discussed. Very cool.
Yeah, so just to elaborate on that a little bit, back in 2012, the Harvard MIT team discovered that every human being has something called an inner ear battery. And what you can do is if you overpower your inner ear battery with a lot of radio waves or radio signals, you can activate it so that it actually generates enough electricity to power like a small hearing aid. The challenge that I am contemplating that I'm working on right now is no one talks about a cyber attack on a human being because this is technology that's very new. But in our world where we don't have, like you said, some people lack compassion, some people lack understanding, some people don't respect your rights or respect your constitution. It would be great to have a panel of people that are constantly talking about how can we create a world where everybody has access to the type of technology that would be necessary if you were attacked as a human being with new cyber technology.
Interesting. Interesting. I love, and I always think about like the personal, the like organizational, and then the societal. So it's interesting to move that internal. Celia, do you want to introduce yourself? We did a round of introductions before you got here. Just what are you working on that's meaningful to you and something someone wouldn't know by looking at you? That's okay, Celia. It's okay. You're welcome also just to put it in the chat if or just say your organization and something you're working on if you're not able to come off mute. Okay, I also am just going to launch a quick poll just because I want to know if you do not want to answer this, you do not have to, but just so I'm kind of aware of the landscape. This is a poll on your political affiliation. I know that many of you run nonpartisan groups, meaning or nonpartisan and 501(c)(3s, and you are not allowed to be outwardly partisan. That is understood, but I just want to get an understanding of the leaning of people here. Again, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but it's helpful to me if you do. Oh no, Falade, the cat. My cat is trouble. She does stuff like that too. Well, hopefully you come back because this is a full 2 hours, but go get the cat. Celia, that is very cool. I love the feminist business model canvas. I use that all the time. Okay. All right. Okay. I'm just going to keep that private, but that's helpful for me to know. Okay. Okay, so I also wanted to just briefly point out we have Olivia Logan in the room who is going to help us understand some of the Senate and congressional races that are um, that are most the most important House and Senate races or the tightest House and Senate races. So she's also going to help us. And then I also wanted to just point out that if the Women's Leadership Challenge is interesting to you, Beth, Mimi, Meg, and Olivia are all alumni, so you can also talk to them. So, and Celia got it. No, no worries at all. So we just want to look at first when we think about feminist leadership, why is feminist leadership important? And we're not going to go through all of these in depth because it will take too long, but just to give a little bit of an overview. And for my alumni, you've already seen some of this, so we will not spend very long on it. But essentially, the whole idea is that leadership has changed. What we need from leaders has changed. Who we need to be as leaders has changed. And the leaders of 1995, white kind of corporate Wall Street booming America are not the leaders of today. So obviously there's many things that have influenced that. Our global pandemic has influenced that. Protest movements all over the world. Something that's been really interesting in my podcast is having guests on my show who say, when I said, are there going to be protests, do you think? And they say, the military is going to crack down really hard. I don't think that people are going to protest because they know they're going to get disappeared and tortured and killed. And they still do. Most recently, my last show was on Venezuela, and the number of people that came out in support of Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, the opposition party, after Maduro declared himself the victor, and everyone knows that that is not the case. The number of people that came out, despite the danger to them, and many were disappeared, was really stunning. And we've seen that all over the world. And I think that there's less of a hesitation to stand up to, authoritarian regimes. We also have seen a rise in women's movements, obviously Iran, and the women's movement in Iran, in Cuba. I had this woman guest in Cuba, and I love women because they employ the most non-traditional approaches. In Cuba, they were taking their refrigerators and their couches out to use to block the streets in order to protest. Then we have Argentina. There have been protests which resulted in the legalization of abortion. In Belarus, South Sudan, which is now embroiled in civil war, but a lot of women are now demanding their rights. But we've also seen a backrolling in women's rights. Today, I don't know if people saw this, that women in Afghanistan are now prohibited from speaking to other women, which is appalling and horrible. And I think that it's beyond just an effort to control women. It is an effort to silence women and to prevent them from organizing. Because if they can't talk to each other, they can't organize. And they can't organize to overthrow the Taliban or to get their rights back. So that is really, really devastating for women in Afghanistan. Tunisia has seen a backrolling in democracy, and obviously the USA. This weekend, I had the pleasure of speaking at a conference in Brazil and met the former Prime Minister of Tunisia. And something that is, I think, really important is to know that democracy is not inevitable, and that it doesn't necessarily stay despite systems. He talked about how, in Tunisia, it had been a democracy for the last 10 years. It was the beginning of the Arab Spring movement, and things seemed great. And then all of a sudden, when he was prime minister, the president organized the military to arrange a coup, and now it is back into a dictatorial country. He had to flee to Qatar. And he was speaking about how just devastating that was, and how hard it was to watch on January 6th when, they kind of look at the US as the model for the world, as a democracy that really can't be overthrown or turned, and how upsetting that was for those types of countries that really are inspired by American democracy to bring about democracy in their countries. Poland has had a rollback in women's rights and also a rollback in LGBTQ rights. We've seen in Italy, and this is under a women leader, a rollback in LGBTQ rights in countries in Italy. And that's an important point to make. When we think about feminism and feminist leadership, it's important to know that men can be feminists and women can be anti-feminist. So, that's why I actually said, like, men were welcome to come to this. Unfortunately, they didn't, because most of the time men think feminism and they think, oh, that doesn't apply to me. And in actuality, it really does. And we'll talk about what that means. Climate change, obviously, we're seeing, huge effects of climate change. It's also becoming a major health issue with people dying. I talked to the Association of Pediatrics yesterday, and they said it's become a children's health issue of eco-anxiety, children getting third-degree burns from falling on the street when it's really hot out, affecting everyone in every corner of the globe. It's not only the US election. We have half of the world's population heading to the polls in 64 countries. So it is a historic election year. And obviously, we've had this rise in societal division politically. That being said, the research does show that Americans are actually more aligned than people think that we are. But the media portrays us as very left and very right, which is something that, as we think of ourselves as leaders, is that our staff is actually more aligned than we might think it is. But the far right and the far left are always going to be the most vocal. The middle of the road usually aren't. And that's where the perception, and that's amplified in the media, and that's where the perception comes that we are so divided as a country, which is obviously amplified by a two-party system where you're either a Democrat or a Republican, and you can be an independent, but I know a lot of independents feel like they don't have a voice in the system that exists. Obviously, Israel-Gaza has had a major effect on the world. Ukraine, which hangs in the balance with funding based upon which president is picked from a military funding perspective. South Sudan is currently embroiled in a civil conflict. And also, we've seen leaders not only say, okay, we've seen this expansionist leader tendency that I thought went away with the creation of the EU, of leaders like Putin saying, we're not just going to, create rifts in our own country, but we're going to go take over other countries and invade other countries. And that's quite upsetting. Technology and generative AI, and I'm sure AJ could have some words about this, but as we look at technology and generative AI, it's so important that women's voices are in the room and feminist voices. I was on ChatGPT the other day and I was trying to create an image for the Women's Leadership Challenge, and I said, uh, please create a non-white, realistic-looking woman, empowered global woman. And I created basically something that looked like an Austin Powers fembot. Still white, perky tits, super high cheekbones that looked scary, like tiny waist. And I said, okay, please create a non-white woman. Please make her heavy set. It didn't even know how to create a woman who was not stick thin or a woman who did not have stick straight hair. It was stunning. And you'll see, like, whenever you ask ChatGPT to create images of women, it's always this like porn fetishized female image. And it's quite troubling because it shows that the people behind it are men who are creating this ideal version of women. AJ, curious if you have any, comments on this as a
Yeah, I got quite a few comments on this one. I have been working with ChatGPT, Claude, Dell, and the one that I found to be the most responsive to my prompts was Leonardo AI. So you might want to try that. But here's some things that I discovered. If you want to create a woman who is heavy set, you can say something like she is robust, she's buxom, she is healthy. I had to distinguish between African American people who are light skinned, because if you say create an African American woman, they generally create a light skinned African American woman. But if you add melanin, you can get skin tones that are much darker. So I've been messing around with that a little bit and pretty much coming to understand you really do have to write a prompt that says, this is what I'm looking for. And you have to describe things like saying something like a non-Caucasian woman, or saying something like a woman of color. It doesn't comprehend that. You have to be very specific. So if you say, I'm sorry. If you say something like, I'd like to see a woman who is of Asian descent and from India, or of Asian descent and from China, then you get someone who looks more appropriate than if you just say, a nondescript woman. So you might want to play around with the verbiage a little bit.
Interesting. Thank you for clarifying that. That's helpful. So we obviously need women leaders in this space, and I'm happy to see so many women that are coming out in this space. Um, Social media, right, and disinformation is very important right now, which has influenced trust and how much we can trust people, how much we can trust leaders. Trust in government is at an all-time low, and the algorithms put people down spiral staircases of misinformation because they encourage you to click on what you've already clicked on instead of other things. A mental health crisis. And then the latest thing, and I think maybe Veronica or Christine was on the latest executive leaders call at the Women's Funding Network, but the backlash that's happening against DEI and ESG, that, environmental, social, and governance. Interestingly, I was reading a report that a lot of corporations have now, instead of saying that they're dedicated to ESG, they're dedicated to decarbonization. That's become less politically charged than the words ESG, even though environmental, social, and governance really just means, to be investing in, ecologically friendly companies that have, male and female quotas, that treat people well, that have women on the board, et cetera. But it's become politicized. And the other thing we're seeing, as I think Veronica and Christine maybe were on that call, is lawsuits. Very, very troubling. Hello Alice and I Fund Women were both sued by partnering or providing grants for, they partner with companies that then provided grants for example, Black women entrepreneurs. And they were sued by picking an identity group and saying, we are going to provide funding for that particular identity group. This is because of a Supreme Court ruling against affirmative action, which has now triggered a backlash where there's a backlash of lawsuits that basically anytime an identity group is said to be given preferential treatment, then there's an opportunity for a lawsuit. And it was devastating to see Hello Alice completely gutted of all of its staff when that happened to them. And I Fund Women is now going, she just posted the other day a long thing basically saying, please help us so that we don't go underground with all of our legal fees because we've been sued. And that is really troubling. Both of those organizations existed or exist to help women entrepreneurs who only get 2% of the global supply chain procurement. Only 2% of global procurement goes to women entrepreneurs and women-owned businesses, and only 2.4% of venture capital goes to women-owned businesses, and that number has not gone up in the last couple of years. So, this is deeply troubling because it can really regress women who are entrepreneurs going into business. It gives us pause in terms of who we are allotting grants to and trying to help the people that are most disenfranchised or have the hardest time getting into the main pool and obviously gives us legal risks. I wonder, I don't know if Veronica or Christine were on that call, but I'm curious your thoughts on this area.
No, I haven't been in the executive calls for a while. They keep conflicting with other meetings, but that's insane. That's just crazy.
Yeah, it's wild. And then Christine, I don't know, were you on that call? I can't remember.
I unfortunately also was not on that call, but when you were talking, I was just thinking about the percentage of venture capital dollars that go to women is even significantly less. I can't remember exactly how much for women of color, BIPOC entrepreneurs, which is really important to note as well.
Yeah, it's way less. I can't even remember. It's like I don't want to say the wrong number. I feel like it's like 0.08 or something. It's small. Not 0.08, 0.8. So this is really important and we want to be able to keep doing the work that we do. But because of the Supreme Court ruling, we have to be smarter about the way that we do this work. And, with the results of election, that could get even harder. I mean, what we have to remember is no matter how whatever president is picked, we're still stuck with the Supreme Court, which is unfortunate. And that means that these kinds of decisions that are disenfranchising minorities, LGBTQ, women are, unfortunately, and enfranchising assault weapons are going to potentially keep coming down the pike. And we have to be prepared for those as leaders. Roe v. Wade, obviously, I was just looking at the latest research that 14 states have banned abortion, 11 have established previously illegal limits. I find the trigger laws unbelievable, like the trigger law of 1864, I think it was, I believe it was Idaho. The researchers showed that 171,000 people have traveled across state lines for abortion in 2023, 1 in 3 women have lost abortion access. The most recent stuff that's been coming down about abortion that I think is quite interesting is actually not about the people getting abortions, but about the OBGYNs providing them, and how OBGYNs are having to pick between basically providing life-saving medical care and with the risk that they might go to jail. And so what you're seeing is brain drain of OBGYNs from abortion restrictive states, because it is just so hard to be a practitioner there, and because they cannot meet their ethical obligations as a doctor, which is to help patients. So they're leaving because they're worried about being put in prison, and they feel such tremendous guilt at not being able to give options or saying you need to go to another state to get care. The other thing that's also interesting is that DNCs are typically very routine. And so what's happening is now, because a DNC can only be performed in an emergency procedure when the woman's the risk is the highest, that doctors or OBGYNs who are newer are not getting that training in the safer cases, where not that they can make a mistake, but it's more routine. There's the woman is not septic or hemorrhaging blood or anything like that. So they're not actually getting the training they need, because they're not being able to provide those DNCs in a regular and routine way. So performing them in only emergency situations is making it more risky. And there's states now where there's entire counties that don't have any OBGYNs, which is stunning and startling. So we're seeing that. I just want to stop here and ask anyone if they have questions, comments, anything to add on anything so far, since I'm kind of drilling through these. Questions, comments?
Yes, I do. This is Miriam. Hi, everyone. I'm concerned because my one of my former professors told me last night that he really believes that Trump is going to win, and I guess I would like to hear the dialogue around. And I know some people are energy people and don't want to talk about it, and I respect that. But then on the other hand, how do we prepare for this dangerous healthcare fiasco should he become elected? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Mimi. Maybe this is a good time to actually move to Olivia and have Olivia update us on the House races and the top Senate races, because because Roe v. Wade is now enfranchised to the states, these House and Senate races are even more important. So, Olivia, if you
Yeah, sure.
Olivia looks like she's moving. What I will say, Mimi, in the
happy to jump in and do. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, Olivia. We lost you for a sec.
Do you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay.
I think we lost you, Olivia.
Okay, great.
Olivia, you're cutting out a little bit. I can't hear you.
Somehow I lost service for you say you wanted me to start with something. What about now?
If you could talk about the top 10 Senate and House races, that would be great.
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so the top 10 Senate races are going to be Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Montana, Nevada, and Ohio, Texas, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Florida. And I'm going to start with Arizona. We have the Democratic candidate Ruben Gallego. Right now, his strengths are he currently has a strong lead in the polls. he went from being like a 52-48 to a 65-35 in favor of Gallego. He appeals to Latino voters. He emphasizes abortion rights, immigration, military, and legislative experience. His biggest con right now is that he must navigate Carrie Lake's popularity and controversial background. And there is some potential skepticism from moderate voters. Currently, right now, Gallego is positioned well with strong Democratic support, focusing on these key issues. Carrie Lake, we recognize her name because she ran for governor of Arizona in 2020. She's got strong name recognition. She appeals to the ultra-conservative voters and focuses on the issues of inflation and immigration, which is starting to become the key talking points in the final days of the campaign for the conservative side. Cons, she's very polarizing because of her past claims about election fraud, and she may struggle with independents and moderate Republicans. Her profile is established and it might energize her base, but her controversial history could alienate some voters. With Georgia, we have Democratic candidate Jon Ossoff. His pros are he is the incumbent with a proven fundraising ability, appeals to urban and suburban voters with strong messaging on key issues. His cons are he must maintain a high turnout among key demographics with potential backlash from conservative rural voters. Right now, his odds are 55-45 in favor of Ossoff. He has the leverage of being the incumbent and the connections, but must ensure he resonates with rural voters in order to secure his victory. He has various challengers. He has several third-party candidates and a nobody Republican, but the pros to that is there's the opportunity to unify the party behind the strongest candidate and can capitalize on Ossoff's perceived weaknesses in his tenure. The cons is they have difficulty distinguishing themselves in a crowded field and lack the support from Trump-aligned voters. Michigan is our next crucial battleground state for the Senate. We have Democratic candidate Elisa Slotkin. Her pros are she has a strong fundraising record. She appeals to the background in national security and focuses on local issues. Right now, the most recent poll has it 52-48 in favor of Slotkin, so it's still a small field margin. Slotkin's national security experience resonates with a lot of voters, but she must overcome the perceptions of being linked to the national Democratic agenda. Her opponent is Republican candidate Mike Rogers. He has an established name in Michigan politics and emphasizes also national security and economic issues. His biggest cons are criticism from Democrats linking him to the National Party and could struggle to gain traction with independent voters. Rogers' political background provides a solid platform, but he's got to be able to appeal to moderates to compete effectively in this race. We have Montana, which is currently held by Democratic Senator Jon Tester. The pros, he is an incumbent, so it gives him a slight edge. He's won in a red state before and focuses on local issues and abortion rights. Cons are he has a significant challenge in a state that Trump won by 16 points and must appeal to moderate Republicans and independents. The odds right now are 48-52 in favor of his opponent, Sheehy. Tester's incumbency and focus on local issues may help, but Sheehy has Trump's backing and this poses significant challenges. Republican candidate Tim Sheehy has the backing of Trump. He has military background, and that appeals to the conservative voters and taps into anti-establishment sentiment. Cons are he's inexperienced in politics. Tester's incumbency poses a significant challenge. And Sheehy's military credentials and Trump's support could energize the base in Montana, but his lack of political experience could be a potential drawback. Next, we have Nevada with Democratic candidate Jackie Rosen. Pros, she's a strong fundraiser and the incumbent. She emphasizes reproductive rights and is appealing to key demographics. Cons are that she may face challenges if Republican turnout is high and needs to ensure engagement from her base. Right now, the odds are 58-42 in favor of Rosen. She's well positioned for re-election, but she must mobilize her base in order to counter Republican efforts. Republican candidate Sam Brown is her opponent. He's got a compelling personal story as a veteran and has potential to appeal to independent voters, but he struggles to gain traction with Republicans and has less name recognition compared to Rosen. If he plays things right and his personal with his personal narrative, it might resonate with voters, but he faces an uphill battle against a well-known incumbent. Now we have Ohio. This seat is currently held by Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown. His pros are he's well-known. He's an established incumbent, has a history of bipartisan appeal, and a strong connection with working class voters. The cons are he's facing a competitive race in a swing state. Right now, the margins are tight. The odds sit at 52-48, but they're still in favor of Sherrod. His experience and local support are critical assets to keeping this seat, though he still faces a strong challenge from Bernie Moreno, who is his Republican challenger. Bernie's pros are he's wealthy and he's self-funding his race. He aligns with Trump and emphasizes immigration and economic issues as his platform. His challenges are going to be that he must overcome the established reputation of Brown and struggles to appeal beyond the Republican base. His self-funding capabilities may bolster his campaigns, but he needs to be able to reach moderate voters to ensure success. In Texas, we have Democratic candidate Colin Allred. He is running against Ted Cruz. Recently, he's been outperforming Ted Cruz in recent polls, highlighting abortion rights. And he's got a strong fundraising base. Most of the time, he has been in a 2 to 3 point margin, but he must overcome Texas's historical Republican lean and potential backlash from conservative views. Ted Cruz is the incumbent. He's got an established name, strong conservative base, and he's an experienced campaigner. The cons are for him is his popularity is declining. I mean, it was also declining in 2018, so we'll just have to see how that plays. It may affect turnout, though, and he's very vulnerable to criticism. Cruz's experience and GOP support are advantages, but his past controversies may impact voter sentiment. In Wisconsin, we have Democratic candidate Tammy Baldwin. Her pros are she is a strong fundraiser. She has an established political presence and connects well with rural voters. Her cons are she could face challenges if Republican turnout is high. Currently, right now, the odds are 55-45 in favor of Baldwin. Her incumbency and connections give her a solid foundation, but voter turnout is going to be crucial in Wisconsin. She is running, Eric Hovde is running against her for the Republican ticket. And his pros are he is self-funding his campaign, and he appeals to business-minded voters. But his cons are he effectively challenged Baldwin's he must effectively challenge Baldwin's established presence and could struggle with the rural connections. His financial backing may allow for a competitive challenge, but again, he's got significant hurdles against Baldwin with her established base. Pennsylvania, we have a Democratic Senator Bob Casey. He's the established incumbent in the race. He's got a strong reputation and focuses on abortion rights and economic stability. His cons is he must contend with a competitive Republican challenger. Currently, right now, in the most recent polling, the odds are 54-46 in favor of Casey. He has a moderate reputation, and in this case, with how close Pennsylvania's elections usually are, that is an asset, but he has to navigate a competitive race and shifting political dynamics. His opponent, Dave McCormick, has a strong financial backing and emphasizes business experience and conservative values, but he has to overcome previous negative and a challenging landscape in a bluish leaning state. His resources may bolster his campaign, but he has to counter Bob Casey's incumbency effectively. In Maryland, we have a Senate race with Democratic candidate Angela Alsobrooks. She's got strong local ties, a progressive focus, and she's community oriented. Her cons are she must maintain momentum against a popular opponent and needs to consolidate the support. In the most recent poll, it's a 60-40 in favor of Alsobrooks. Maryland is a traditionally Democratic state, but Hogan has moderate appeal and could narrow the race. He held the governorship for 2 terms in a row. Republican candidate Larry Hogan has a high popularity status as the former governor and bipartisan appeal. The cons are that he faces an uphill battle in a heavily Democratic state and has to continue to distance himself from Trump. His past successes as governor provides a potential advantage, but he still is struggling with acquiring significant crossover appeal. Florida.
Yeah, let's do Florida, and then I think we can stop there because I don't know if anyone's going to retain as much information as you will.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Florida, we've got Democratic candidate Debbie Marskell Powell. Her pros are she has a strong focus on healthcare and abortion rights and appeals to the suburban women, which we did not appeal to in the 2016 election cycle. She faces a tough opponent in a conservative-leaning state and needs to unify the party. Right now, the polling is 45-55 in favor of Rick Scott. Her critical issues could mobilize support, but Scott's established presence is a formidable challenge. He's got an established name, strong fundraising, and he was the former governor, but he faces challenges with moderate voters and could have potential backlash due to state issues. But his background provides advantages, but the dissatisfaction with his record could impact voter support.
Olivia, that was brilliant and super interesting. I need to do a Samantha politics on this. I don't know why I haven't yet. So we can really deep dive into all these races. So just like thinking overwhelmingly like at the map of how many seats would the Democrats have to win to have a 2/3 majority? And then in the Senate, how many would the Democrats have to win to have a majority?
So to have the majority right now, technically they have the Democrats have a majority, but it would be more beneficial for them to acquire another seat. And then, oh, my lights are bad. Yeah, these are really bright lights, and for some reason, my internet is only working in this corner. I don't know why. And then in the House, we actually need to pick up 4 seats. I know we didn't really get to the House candidates because that was a lot of information, but we can definitely do a deep dive on another Zoom on the House candidates, but those are going to be crucial. There's some messaging that we haven't really hit on recently, and that is that Trump keeps talking about how he has a special surprise that he's been working on with Johnson. And Johnson keeps talking about how if he has a House majority, he is going to contest the election results because he is the one that gets to confirm them. And the House gets confirmed on January 3rd, and then the presidency will be January 6th. So he could potentially contest and turn everything. And so, and of course, if Trump does win the presidency, there's going to be a lot of backlash about that. And so that's just something to watch. We definitely need to pick up those 4 House seats.
Thank you so much, Olivia. That was brilliant. Does anyone have any questions for Olivia before we move on? And I'll address Miriam's question a little bit deeper. Do you have any questions on the races? Okay. I think so, and this I think goes to, you know, what Miriam, it's horrible, right? If it becomes even more deserts than they already are. But I think that is like that is the reason that we have to mobilize, I think, as feminist leaders. And like I said, too, that sometimes, especially like if you run a women's fund, for example, that's nonpartisan, to be able to do it in ways that are more creative and aren't so that there's, you're mitigating the chance of being sued. But I did want to provide like that example of feminist leadership, and then we'll talk about some of kind of what to expect as a leader in general, which Olivia just started to allude to, and ways that you might be able to handle that. So this definition of feminist leadership, I love that feminist leadership is actually, I would get rid of the word woman. I didn't even realize that's there. It should not say women. It should say people with a feminist perspective and vision of social justice, individually and collectively, transforming themselves to use their power, resources, and skills in non-oppressive, inclusive structures and processes to mobilize others, especially other women, around a shared agenda of social, cultural, economic, and political transformation for equality and the realization of human rights for all. And so, part of this is, what I teach in the Women's Leadership Course, which is how do you tap into your own power. And Mimi was in a reproductive rights infomercial, which was amazing when she was in the class. But also figuring out how to use our power, resources, and skills in order to mobilize others around a shared agenda. And if we're working in rural states, and that I think gets to my next point, right, is, if we're working in rural states, of figuring out how do we activate and support women in rural states where there are those abortion deserts or reproductive deserts. Like one thing I've been talking to different women's funds about doing is potentially supporting women nonprofit leaders in those areas that are kind of reproductive deserts, to be able to give them the support that they need to be able to continue mobilizing in the face of so much challenge. Generally speaking, though, Miriam, I don't have a perfect answer to your question. I think there's going to need to be more funding to be donated towards reproductive rights. There's going to, and I think what's troubling too is if we look at Project 2025, it's way back on another slide. I had a whole thing on Project 2025 here. One of the things that Project 2025 might do is block abortion medication shipping. So we might see where it's even harder for women to be able to get abortion pills. And also knowing that getting an abortion pill doesn't mean that the woman is able to successfully terminate the pregnancy, that if it doesn't terminate all the way, that they might still have to go to the hospital for D&C, which is what we saw in one of the cases that was recently in the ProPublica article. So it's not like a fix-all solution regardless, because it may not actually terminate the pregnancy. Hi, Vanessa, welcome. And then that the idea that they might potentially reverse abortion drugs. What I found so bizarre about Project 2025 as I was reading it was it went on and on about how the threat to the family was single mothers and not having fathers, but then advocated for every pregnancy being brought to term. And there's a weird line in there about, but we have to support women, so we're going to increase funding for abortion or for adoptions. But there was this whole thing about, how not having a father and single motherhood was like a threat to the family unit in America, but then simultaneously said, we're going to provide no reproductive access. And not only, but cutting sex education, pregnancy prevention, and abortion programs. As many of you already know, the states with the highest rates of teen pregnancy are states with abstinence-only sex education. So that kind of education is not working. And we are also looking at potentially limits on IVF, on egg freezing, on all different sorts of things. Although I think Biden just put into something where that I think Plan B can just be bought over or put on the shelves. Or someone correct me, I'm messing it up, but something just happened with that. So with reproductive rights, it will get worse. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It will get worse if Trump is elected. If there are some states, though, that hopefully pick up not just women, but feminists into their state legislatures or governorships in states, again, Roe v. Wade pushes it back to the states, then because that's the problem, is so many of these legislatures are dominated by men who are mostly anti-feminist men. So, but other things, to prepare for from a leadership perspective. Actually, the one more thing that I want to point out in Project 2025 that I think is really important. This is in Project 2025, and I think this is going to make it even harder to do the work that we do. Meg, can you read this out loud for us?
I'm actually recovering from a huge coughing fit.
Okay,
I turned off my camera.
Never mind, Meg. Mimi, you want to read this for us?
Okay. Let me tell you what's going on with me, and this, I want everyone to be very happy. But my dog not going to be here until Christmas, so I'm trying to take care of him and listen to this too.
Okay, so I'll read it out. Don't forget it. It's okay. Okay, the next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society hard targets for woke culture warriors. This starts with deleting the terms sexual orientation and gender identity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, gender equality, gender equity, gender awareness, gender sensitive, abortion, reproductive health, reproductive rights, and any other term out of every federal rule, agency regulation, contract, grant, regulation, and piece of legislation that exists. This is highly problematic from not just from a rights perspective, but from the ability to do good work. I focus a lot on feminist foreign policy, and there's a woman named Cynthia Enlow, and she says that if you don't do a gender analysis to an issue, you don't get your solution correct. So, for example, China's one-child policy was an example of a gender-blind policy aimed at trying to limit population in China. And of course, what happened was that girls were less preferenced by parents. And so girls were the ones that were aborted, given up for adoption, put into sex trafficking, sold, abandoned orphanages, killed, just horrible stuff that in the now has resulted in adults, women who don't have any documentation because their parents couldn't get them a birth certificate because they didn't want people to know they were born. So they can't get education, they can't get employment. They're essentially stateless in some respects, which is against international law. There's skewed sex ratios where there's not enough women to marry men, which has irritated men and had an impact on men's ability to perform masculinity, which impacts their identity and their sense of self-worth. There's been a rise in property prices because of that. Elderly parents don't have enough kids to take care of them because there's only one kid, and women are more likely to take on the elderly care burden. The trauma of children who were abandoned in that time period. Bride prices are 100 times higher. More men in society means there are a higher likelihood of protracted war, which is also quite interesting. And now women, they're begging women to have kids, and they don't want women to have a lot of kids because it's too expensive. So this is really troubling from an analytical standpoint because it's what enables us to do the work that we do. I'm wondering if I could ask Christine, working with, I think you said the Massachusetts Commission on the Status of Women, if I'm not mistaken.
Can you just repeat the question? I just have my 2-year-old with me.
That's okay. No, I'm just wondering, from your perspective, being the executive director of a women's group and then also working on the state level, thinking about gender analysis and, these areas being deleted and what that might look like for you or what your thoughts are on that.
I think you're just going to have to come back to me. I'm still in the car with my 2-year-old now.
Okay.
So I couldn't fully hear you or read the slide. But
That's
definitely
okay.
do come back to me, and my apologies.
No, no worries. This is I guess the next thing I'll have during the day. In the evening, I know is tough for people, so I appreciate everyone being here. Anyone else have comments or thoughts on this particular area that they'd like to share? Okay. Okay, so going back to, as a leader, thinking about what to expect, right? So this, gender equality and all of this being taken out of, that language being taken out of everything is going to make it a lot harder to do targeted work and to even get the money to be able to do data analysis. So to be able to disaggregate between women and men, girls and boys, we might not be able to even get the funding to be able to do that analysis and or be able to kind of separate between those different identity groups because of all this affirmative action stuff and this particular line in the here. Programs that are gender equality can be cut or dedicated to gender equity, gender equality, abortion, reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights could be cut. There's even talk in Project 2025 about cutting the Department of Education. Olivia, is that right? Am I getting that correct? Because I was trying to understand that today. That's right, Meg?
Yeah, that and the EPA both. Just getting rid of them.
Wild. So that could mean, and climate change, as we know, has a bigger effect on women and girls. So, as a leader, some of the things that we can expect is obviously that climate change will have even more of effect on women and girls because if the EPA is gone. And Trump has also talked about, where is it? Cutting climate subsidies, blocking renewables funding, expanding coal, oil, gas mining, and logging on federal lands, ending climate data collection, repealing the Inflation Reduction Act and the climate provisions of the CHIPS Act, so that we'll see even a bigger impact on climate and, unfortunately, our commitment to climate. And so that means that climate change is going to keep getting even worse than potentially it might have already gotten. Other things we see in Project 2025 is that Trump will want to abandon NATO and end U.S. funding to Ukraine, a destabilization of relations with China and Taiwan, exiting non-proliferation forums, mass civil service firing, so getting rid of a tremendous, I think it's about 50,000 civil service employees and replacing them with loyalists to Trump, and bypassing Senate confirmations for a bunch of Senate confirmed roles, typically Senate confirmed roles. Pardons for January 6th, criminals, targeting political rivals, journalists, activists, and disfavored citizens. Probing of entities supporting ESG and DEI initiatives. This is what I was referring to earlier, of probing, that there's going to be not just potentially lawsuits, but actual encouragement of DOJ to probe entities supporting ESG and DEI and investigate them. It goes on and on and on. But so what to expect as leaders? We can potentially expect civil unrest and violence, which is deeply troubling. Impairments with people being able to engage in work because they have transportation issues, because there's protests and they can't get to work. Mental health concerns. You might have to position your organization on how you stand, especially if there's a dispute over who won, and figure out how you're going to be able to do that. Generally speaking, if you are a 501c3 nonprofit, you should typically not support a candidate, but you can be supportive of policies and against policies. There will be deep misinformation all over the place about, people stuffing ballot boxes and eating them, and, illegals coming in and voting. And even, on the other side, there's going to be a lot of misinformation about voting practices. There's the possibility that certain communities might be targeted in electoral dispute campaign. For example, illegal immigrants, Jews, any sort of identity group as somehow being responsible for this particular result. Employee turnover. Something that we have to think about is that, employees will turn over for a couple reasons. One, it is a very sensitive time, and people feel like if you're not aligned with their views, often that you don't respect them, and they could leave. There's also the potential that an administration will pull in a lot of people from a particular political party, and they might leave for an administration position or to try to gun for an administration position. They might be losing support. There was something else in Project 2025 about lessening pay for overtime workers. And so they might quit because they feel like they're not being compensated appropriately, or they don't have enough childcare or elderly care to be able to continue to work. So we may see employee turnover and women not being able to access healthcare. I wonder if there's anything else that you all think about as, as leaders, what you can expect from, as a result of this election, regardless of which way it goes, right? This is for Harris or Trump. Anyone else have thoughts on this? Okay. So some of things that I think are going to be important from a leadership perspective to do in the wake of the election is this was just an idea I had, and I love your thoughts on it, but to potentially have an employee or external party who's a nonpartisan fact checker who is able to kind of put out, they're able to do a scan of all the different sources and say, okay, based on the facts, and maybe it's not an employee, maybe it's an external consultant that is messaging out, facts to be able to stem misinformation, at least within your own organization. Or I think there might need to be monitoring of Slack groups. And I don't know what this looks like, but employee channels to be able to monitor spreading of disinformation. We think of a lot about Facebook and LinkedIn and all these platforms and how they spread disinformation, but there's also a lot of private channels and internal communications that our employees have on that can be sources for conflict, misinformation, and I think training people, leaders who run the different Slack channels to be able to deal with how do you confront disinformation that's being spread, and or deal with conflict and to warring parties, as you will say, if it's within an internal communication, how that's approached, and or messaging on what is, for the workplace and what is not for the workplace. That being said, I don't think that that usually works all that well because people will always bring it to work because it cuts deep at their identity and who they are. And they're quite passionate about things that affect their, like they say, the personal is political, the political is personal. That is a feminist leadership principle. Training for staff generally on how to have courageous conversations, to be able to talk to one another in a respectful way where they can say, I hear your side and this is what I'm hearing you say, and I appreciate that. I'd love a chance to share my perspective. Can I share my perspective? Yes. Most people, and I really recognize this particularly with Gen Z, I think because they've been raised so much online, do not know how to have courageous conversations. It becomes a back and forth war on the internet between very far right, accusatory, increasingly toxic conversation, instead of calling someone on the phone, old school, or setting up a Zoom to have a hard conversation with them. Empower Global does do training on how to have courageous conversations, whether it's about the elections, the war in Gaza. Sophie Tarnoska is also an alumni of the Women's Leadership Challenge, and she is an amazing trainer too that I deploy on this topic. She does dialogue between conflicted societies with her nonprofit. Teaching people how to deal with disputes, people leaders, how are you going to deal with fights about all these issues? Potential of having emergency ombudsmen, so people who are ready to kind of be resources, because human resources is going to be overwhelmed and is going to be consumed by upset people, again, regardless of the way that it goes. But obviously, if you have a more democratic aligned organization, they'll be more upset with a Republican win and vice versa. Prepping leadership with talking points so they know how to talk and talk about this. Being able to have external messaging that condemns any sort of violence and upholds feminist values, especially if you run a feminist organization, and what are those values? And again, you can do that in a way that's not overtly partisan, as you might say. For example, in the war on Gaza, that was very contentious for me. But, when we look at the war in Gaza, it's really an example of patriarchy playing out because it's violence, it's a president who's trying to get out of corruption, it's a terrorist group that doesn't really care about people and is trying to escape accountability, and civilians are suffering the most, and women and girls are suffering the most. So it is a women's issue, but I don't have to say, one way or the other, which people will get angry at, right? But you can try to take that approach where it's upholding feminist values and not necessarily as one way or the other. If there is more reproductive deserts, supporting women to be able to access and travel for healthcare, and supporting families potentially, right? We always talk about supporting women, but if there is a family that wants to have an abortion, we always talk about giving the woman money, but I frankly wouldn't want to go get an abortion alone and drive 10 hours to another state. I want my partner with me. And yet we often don't talk about helping the family recover from that, or giving funding for the man to go with her, or the time off to be able to go, to be able to get reproductive care in another state. And men are important to be supportive during those periods for their wives, or women if it's a LGBTQ relationship. We're going to need to mobilize within states, and especially those rural deserts like we talked about, and direct more funding to reproductive rights groups, particularly in rural areas. Anything else that people can think of that you think is important in this post-election period, or how you're going to handle it at your organization?
Yeah. Hi, Samantha.
Hi.
Hi. So I have been doing sports immigration, but I'm actually representing a fair number of Muslim fencers, and some of them were really afraid about their future immigration situation if Trump wins the election because of his prior Muslim ban. So now I think, yeah. Oh, I was just going to continue that most of them are from Egypt, and our government hasn't had a problem with Egypt. And I remember when Trump tried to impose his ban before, his advisors told him he had to find some type of justification for the countries that he chose to name.
Oh, interesting. Well, I do know one thing that they are going to do is to, I was looking for the slide. They're going to be basically getting rid of a lot of student visas. So, and not just student visas, but like H-1Bs, H-1, I think it's H-1C, like all of these visas, these lotteries where students who went to, Fletcher, where you and I went to try to be able to work in the States for a company, which sometimes even if a company will sponsor them, it's still a lottery, the H-1B. And he's going to get rid of some of those visa programs to be able to for students to be able to get jobs in the US or internationals, foreigners. I don't know particularly about Egypt. What I will say, just from political knowledge, is that Egypt is a close ally of the United States. And I think that we are invested in keeping them out of the war in Gaza from a political standpoint. And that's quite important to us. And also, we've also had to pressure Egypt to provide aid for people in Gaza and humanitarian corridors for people coming from Gaza. So, I don't know about Egypt, but I do think that there will be a lot more cut downs on immigration, and that generally speaking, he's already threatening mass deportations of people.
But, in one word, he says immigrants, and another word, he says only undocumented immigrants. So,
yeah, it's so hard to know. I did find it deeply troubling when Stephen Miller said America's for Americans, which is ludicrous coming from like a Jewish family from Eastern Europe.
Well, what's really interesting is exactly 100 years ago that the 1924 immigration restrictions went into effect that cut immigration for most groups except Northern Europeans.
That was, what was that act called again? Immigration.
I don't remember the name of the act, but it was the immigration law that went into effect in 1924. And so our ancestors, well, I mean, on my Jewish side of the family, were restricted. I'm half. So my Northern European ancestors would have been accepted, except they had come here much earlier.
Yeah, a lot of the racial stuff is targeting people that are non-white. And, that's unfortunate. And I think that's, we're going to see a continuation down that road. I'm also worried about attacks against people who are from that group. I mean, already even we're seeing people who look Latino or who are speaking Spanish in supermarkets and public places being spit on, being told, if a friend of mine, they said, if Trump is elected, he's going to send you back to Mexico. She's American, but she has Latin roots. So I think that this is one of the issues with the Trump presidency is that in this last rally, there was such hateful rhetoric against minorities, and the ability to be able to say that publicly, that Puerto Rico is garbage, which was just so outrageous, even though it was a joke, that's gonna, if you're able to do that publicly at Madison Square Garden, what does that say about your supporters being able to do that when, if he is empowered, they feel empowered that they're not going to face any sort of repercussions. So again, I don't know what will result in it. And Project 2025, I mean, the other thing about Project 2025 that's so insidious is that it's not just about the way that it lays out the plan. It's also all of that it's like they've put together a Rolodex of people that are Trump loyalists that will do what he's doing. And this is not even Democrat or Republican anymore. They literally refer to it as Trumpism. Like, this is like a new party. This is not even Republicanism anymore. It's like, we will employ Trump loyalists. And if you have another 50,000 civil servants, I believe that's about the number that will be kicked out in favor of Trump political appointees, and civil servants are famously nonpartisan. And I've done so many trainings for government workers from all different agencies who are just loyal civil servants, and they love their job and they serve, and they, who's president that's not part of their game. They're there to serve. It's really upsetting that they will be sacked in favor of loyalists with no experience. But that also means that there will be less opportunity to be able to enforce like civil service, like the way that things are done with checks and balances, because there will be more political appointees that are trying to basically say, well, too bad, we're going to do it this new way, because there's going to be more mass mobilization towards political appointees. So anyway, not to make this, a downer, the other thing that I wanted to talk about from like a leadership standpoint is that I think what is good, again, regardless of who wins, but I think what has been really interesting and cool to see is the outpouring of support for a female I guess she's biracial, Asian and South Asian and Black candidate. And there have been, people said like, oh, women can't win, and when it became clear that Joe Biden had very little popular support, I think it was just generally very encouraging to see so much money and so much support and so much excitement pour into and behind a female candidate who is a woman of color, who I don't think anyone thought would get that type of popular support. So, and the other thing I think that it's doing too, which is interesting, is I think it's calling into new questions of masculinity, with Walt kind of representing this new masculinity of, his son will cry at rallies, and he's like an empathetic guy who joined the oversaw the LGBTQ council, but he was also a football coach. And this interesting blend of masculinity where he's not so far that people are kind of decrying him. He's this new version of masculinity where you can be empathetic and support women's rights and also watch football on Sundays. So I think it's going to create a really new conversation around masculinity. And one of the things I'm actually going to be doing is launching a men's group for men in climate, which is something that I'm working on, a transformational leadership program that includes adventure weekends so that we can bring men into the fold. I'd love to hear if anybody has any more questions, comments, anything to add. Great. So when we think of becoming a feminist leader, we didn't really talk about this that much, but some of the aspects of feminist leadership, and my students already know this: global citizenship, which is why, again, like when I look at this, it's not saying like Trump or Harris, but also looking at this from a global cooperation standpoint, that Trump does have an isolationist agenda to pull out of NATO, to stop cooperating in international treaties and agreements. And I think that global citizenship and global cooperation is an aspect of feminist leadership that's quite important. A willingness to take risks and transform, redistribution of power, the personal is political, cooperating versus competing, innovation and creativity, starting where you stand, which means Greta Thunberg sitting outside the Capitol with a sign that said, I don't know what it said, but against climate change. And now she's a leader of a climate movement. Ethics and integrity. And I think we have to, through this period as leaders, also think about how do we lead through turbulence by going back to our values and practicing what we preach. Embracing collective power, nonviolence, peace, people, the planet. The other thing we're going to have to do if there is a Trump win is figure out how do we enable grassroots climate initiatives if we are pulling out of all of these, or enabling mining, drilling, gas, et cetera, and pulling out of more climate agreements. So when it comes to becoming a feminist leader, these are, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I know, Vanessa, you just came, but the Women's Leadership Challenge, which I started teaching in 2020 and now have over 100 alumni from 36 countries, including four amazing women who are here today: Olivia, Mimi, Beth, and Meg. And what I realized after teaching the course for a while is that I actually had identified what that framework of development was for feminist leadership. And I moved the course around a lot from when it started. But the first phase is deconstruction, which is really deconstructing the past and looking at your story. How does your story fit into your legacy, fit into your leadership style? How do the things you've been through influence what's called your resilience arsenal, or your strength and ability to bounce back. Individualization, which is identifying who you are as an individual, and that includes your intrinsic power map. And your intrinsic power map means your strengths, your personality, your values, your quirks, your talents, all of the things that make you you, especially if we end up with a more difficult presidency for women's rights. But even with all the tumult that's going to happen, it's really important that we're able to access all of the pieces of ourselves to confront these challenges that we're about to face. How do you advance within a world that might be hostile? And or just generally advance as a woman. Something that struck me that somebody said the other day is that Trump can be lawless and Kamala has to be flawless. That women are just held to higher standards and that we have to be perfect. And Trump can be whatever and say horrible things, but he's whatever. He can still be president. He doesn't distract from him. Whereas I still remember when poor Hillary had pneumonia and almost fell down the stairs at a rally, how she was just blasted in the media. Feminist leadership, which includes diving into these principles of feminist leadership way more deeply and figuring out what are the behaviors, principles, and practices that lead to feminist leadership, and how do you embody those especially in tough times. And then how do you create culture change? So how do you create systems change on the issues that you care about? And we look at all sorts of different change models from the private sector, from private interviews I've done with women's rights activists, from all sorts of social change literature, interviews, our own work, et cetera, and look at how do you create culture change. And that's where I usually bring a speaker in. So that is the Women's Leadership Program. It is a year-long program in cohorts of 8 women each. Like I said, I do have a couple amazing women already for the next cohorts from, people who are working on sexual violence to labor rights to Indigenous women's rights. It's going to be a really amazing cohort as usual. And there's one cohort that's virtual and there's one that meets once in Washington, D.C. a month and once virtually. I would love if one of my alumni didn't mind kind of speaking about the Women's Leadership Challenge. And, this is for the women on the call, even if this program is not for you, just to know, especially if you run a women's fund, that this is really powerful for women who are nonprofit founders or who are high up at nonprofits to be able to get the support that they need and the strategy they need to be able to create social change. I wonder if Meg or Olivia minds mentioning just kind of their experience in the Women's Leadership Challenge and why they would recommend it.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little bit about my experience with the Women's Leadership Challenge. I have a couple things going on in my apartment right now, so I'm out in the hallway, but hopefully no one comes by while I'm talking, or if they do, I'll try and recruit them. But anyway, I was in the 2021 in-person DC cohort. And I had actually started my business and I had business partners that were just not as invested as I was. And so this was a great opportunity to get some leadership foundation that I needed to be able to build out my business. And once I was able to detach myself from those business partners and get the foundation that I needed, and the support from my cohort. And then also we do some introductions to some cross cohorts. And so we've been able to support each other that way. I've been able to really have my business take off. And now I'm going into year 4. So I highly recommend the Women's Leadership Challenge just because it gives you the foundation that you need no matter what you're doing. And you also create lasting relationships that are very beneficial for both networking and just personal relationships to maintain.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And it's been so awesome seeing the growth of your business and just see you kick ass and enable these down ballot candidates to succeed in hard states. It's just, yeah, I'm proud.
Thank you.
Meg, do you want to say anything?
Yeah. I came at the Women's Leadership Challenge from kind of a different location. I was raised by a feminist single dad. And so for me, the experience of patriarchy is kind of faceless and impersonal. Um, but it certainly does exist. um, so while I never had the experience of feeling downgraded at home for being female, I also didn't have a lot of women friends until I was like about 30. Like I didn't know how to engage the context that a lot of women seemed to have that I didn't. So I got a lot of really great things out of the Women's Leadership Challenge. One of them being a group of incredible women who were supportive and not like sabotaging like a lot of the women in my professional life have been. And I got to know a lot of really incredible other women that I know that I can call on to ask for advice or help whenever I need it. And I even got to be part of some, nice religious celebrations along the way and stuff, or other people's celebrations, which was really nice because I'm a godless heathen and I never get to do that. So it was really nice to be part of them, and I also got to see people's pets, which was great because I love them. It was just a really empowering experience for me as someone who maybe didn't necessarily feel the sting of patriarchy in the same way that a lot of women do, but who nonetheless had been kind of on the periphery of community for a long time. So having that kind of complete community and complete unconditional support, and even just getting to meet with incredible women and people who don't necessarily want something from you, was just fabulous support. It really kind of changed my head about what was possible for me. So I highly recommend it.
Thanks, Meg.
Yeah, life changing.
And now Meg works for me. Or works with me. I love. Beth or Mimi, no pressure, but you're welcome to say anything if you'd like.
Well, on a different kind of note, but I think in the same direction, it helps you to really kind of seek positivity. Like, even though we talked about what we talked about, there was an element of elevation, an element of community. And to be brief, I see young women differently. I'm 62, and there was a young lady in her scooter who pulled out in front of me. The next thing I know, I didn't hit her, I almost did. So she was in the grocery store and she was the cashier. And I asked her, I said, "Are you trying to kill yourself?" And she said, "I didn't see you." And then she started doing these weird things, very nice weird things with her hair. And we just started talking about various things. And so she's going to invite me to her speech at her class around goal setting and future. I don't know the name of the class. I think it's some kind of women's business class. But at any rate, it, for me, changed how I look at things, and I take things an opportunity to lead. I always am looking for that. And that's all I'll say. It changed me significantly. Thanks. Life-changing.
Mimi, that means so much to me. Yeah, that's amazing. Beth? if you're
Yeah, so I actually I got an EIDL loan and I did a lot of coaching during the pandemic. So Samantha's group was one of the things I did, and it was really it was a great group of women from all really interesting backgrounds who had really innovative, interesting projects. And we got into feminist theory and applied it to our projects also, and had some great discussions and developed our own, kind of narrowed down and focused our own goals in terms of what we wanted to accomplish.
Yeah, and Beth did a great project on the ERA, which I still remember.
Well, yeah. So basically, my issue right now is I am representing a group at the UN Commission on the Status of Women meetings, but I'm muffled basically because the organization, every policy statement has to go through the governing board of the organization. And we have been told that we are only there to gather information and report. And so I can't make any statements that could be construed as a statement on behalf of the organization. So that's where that is now.
Beth, if you want to say after, let me troubleshoot this with you because I need to fully understand what's going on. So
well, basically, it's an organization that represents lawyers and judges who handle cases in federal courts, and it's nonpartisan. So they can't really take any position. It seems like the position that women should be able to have rights would not be partisan. But unfortunately, even something as simple as that is seen as controversial politically, which it kind of plays into what we're talking about with the election and the stifling of women's speech.
Yeah, that should not be controversial for women to have rights. So, okay, so we're going to need to
but I have to, one thing I have to say, the head of the Commission on the Status of Women for this period is a man from Saudi Arabia.
Oh my God.
Because it's a rotating council. Then this year Saudi Arabia gets it and they don't allow women in leadership positions.
Oh my God. I can't even sometimes. Yeah, that's the UN is a tough one. I'm happy to stay after with you and chat about it and see if we can strategize.
Oh, okay. I mean, I can do it. I could do things in my own, in my own capacity, but it's something that comes up whenever judges speak at a panel. They have to claim they're speaking in their own capacity and not in the capacity of an organization. So,
which you can also do. But
well, you can, but the thing is, if something comes back as appearing that you represent the organization, then it creates controversy. That's the only thing.
I got it. So you have to be extremely clear that you don't represent, that you're representing yourself and not the organization. And
yeah,
it's risky. Well, maybe use it as an information gathering thing to be able to investigate. And
well, that's the thing. I'm continuing to do that, and there's a really interesting group of women who have been doing work for years in passing local ERA resolutions. So the idea is that if all these resolutions are enacted on a citywide and statewide basis, then there's no excuse for the government to not enact things nationally.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah. I would say use it as an information gathering thing and a relationship building exercise to be able to also identify the power brokers and where the power sits, and to be able to then figure out what your sphere of influence is and what levers to pull with who, and that you might have to be doing some backdoor negotiations instead of public statements.
Yeah, but there are also people who've been doing this work for years, and I'm not ahead of what they're doing. So it's it's always important to find out who's been doing what.
Right. And I think that's part of it too.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I know we're in our last couple minutes, so I also wanted to just say I'm going to be doing like a 5-day free masterclass, like I said, on the feminist leadership formula. Thank you, AJ. I really appreciate you coming. But I just wanted to invite, I mean, all of you women, half of you know me, but for the 3 that don't, I'd love to get to know you more, Veronica, and hear more about what you're working on. Vanessa, I'd love to get to know you more. Just feel free. I have time next week, finally. So feel free to put time on my calendar just to get to know you and to hear more about your working on, see if we can collaborate. If you're interested in the Women's Leadership Challenge, I can tell you more. Or if you're interested in, if you think someone else might be interested, that's helpful. But just generally speaking, want to be able to support anyone who's working on these issues. Are there any questions? And then this is the Feminist Leadership Formula, which is the 5-day free masterclass I'm going to be doing, but it currently has the wrong dates. And my website designer said he was correcting it, but it is not. It looks like it's not correct yet, but it's going to be the week before the week before Thanksgiving. So I'll put that in the chat too. Just ignore the dates for now. It's going to be the week before Thanksgiving, but if you want to make sure that you are registered, there's that. I just want to ask if there's any questions. If there's any questions or comments. Questions. Thanks, Vanessa. Why don't we end? I always like doing this at the end of a training. What is one of your top takeaways from today? What is one insight you have moving forward from today? What is one insight you have? One insight. You can share it in the chat or come off mute. What is one insight? Anyone learn anything today? Anyone?
I would say the power of gender analysis.
Cool. Thank
and
you.
the gaps. There are too many gaps where it's not being done, and we're going to railroad ourselves if we're not careful. That's it.
I know
Thanks.
you might have done my class before I had a section on feminist foreign policy. I have a whole thing on feminist foreign policy now. Did you have that when I was taught your class?
I don't think so. No,
Yeah,
no,
I think I developed it afterwards because I did this talk at the Wilson Center and then had a whole feminist foreign policy framework. So I'll have to let you come observe one of those sessions on feminist foreign policy. I'll invite you to the next cohort when I do it.
I might be ready for a reboot. Let me think on it. But yeah, that's how good it is, ladies. The fact that I was about doing it another year. Yeah.
I love you back. I love you back, Mimi. We can also talk about the mastermind group, which I'm going to launch again, which is not doesn't have curriculum, but is women supporting each other and spot coaching on these issues. So I can also talk to you about what that looks like because it's a lot cheaper than the Women's Leadership Challenge.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Mimi. Vanessa, thank you. Ways to support the leaders I coach. Fabulous. And I'm glad you found that out. I should have posted it earlier in the Women's Foreign Policy Network. Veronica, it was great to see you. And please set up a time for us to talk, or I'll send you an email because I want to hear more when we're not at a conference surrounded by a bazillion people. That would be great. And then Olivia, thank you so much for your expert political analysis. I'm always amazed at your in-depth knowledge of all different candidates from literally every state. I cannot keep track, and I'm just incredibly amazed at your ability to analyze all of these different races. So I just want to thank you so much for coming.
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to do it. And yeah, if you want to do, like, I don't know, with your Samantha Politics, if you want to do an election debrief and we can pick like the top 3 to 5 surprising elections on election day, I'm happy to do that.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah, I'd love to do. Let me look at my calendar. I think let's do a show next week. I think that's a good idea. Pick a night.
Okay. Cool.
Cool. All right, everybody. Well, we're right up on the hour, so if there's no questions, I will let you all go. But thank you for coming, and let's, also mobilize. I also want to say, if you do want to get active in the next couple of days and you need resources on where to volunteer, how to volunteer, what's most important to volunteer for, etc., or you want to disseminate that information to your members, just contact me and I can help you with that. Because the last the last, this is GOTV now, the last week is critical to getting out the vote. All right, that's it. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night, and I'll send out the recording tonight. Bye, everyone.